Okay.
Hello, I wish to welcome our speakers and everyone watching or listening, wherever you may be. Let me begin by acknowledging the Jagera, Yugara and Ugarapul people who have long been regarded as the traditional custodians of the land, covering Ipswich and surrounds, from where I am virtually casting from here. I'd like to also note that this continent we now call Australia was never ceded, and pay my respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders, past, present and emerging. My name is Gilbert Burgh, and I'm a member of the Australian Philosophy Research Group, or APRG for short. This is the second of our APRG Edifying Conversations series, a series of dialogues between Dr. Mary Graham, who I'll introduce you to in a moment, and Indigenous and non-Indigenous scholars from a wide range of disciplines, talking and walking together to inquire into the synergies between different world views. Mary is a Kumba person through her father's heritage and a Waka Waka person through her mother's heritage. Pardon me. She is adjunct associate professor in the School of Political Science and International Studies at the University of Queensland, where she has lectured on subjects in Aboriginal history, politics, and comparative philosophy, and was awarded an honorary doctorate at the University of Technology for her lifelong commitment to scholarship and community. She was the administrator of the Aboriginal and Islander Care Centre during the 1970s and has been on boards and committees of many Aboriginal organisations in Brisbane for many, many years since. She has worked in native title area with the Foundation for Aboriginal Islander Research Action. Mary was a member of the first Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation. She was and still is also engaged in international research projects involving Australia nationally and internationally. She currently does research work with Institute of Urban Indigenous Health, the leading Aboriginal health organisation in Brisbane. Although now retired, and as we find out, Mary's never really retired, she always continues to work with her own traditional community and organisations on a variety of projects. Now, joining Mary, is Morgan Brigg, who is an associate professor in the School of Political Science and International Relations, also at the University of Queensland. He is a specialist in conflict resolution, peace building, governance, development and innovative approaches to cross-cultural relations and the politics of knowledge. His work facilitates exchange between Western and Indigenous political philosophies, pardon me, as part of a wider exploration of the political and cultural differences, governance and selfhood. Current projects examine ways of recuperating Indigenous forms of governance and conflict resolution, and the promise of ideas of relationality for making the field of conflict resolution a genuinely global adventure. Morgan's books include The Politics of Conflict Resolution, Responding to Difference, and two co-edited volumes, Mediating Across Difference and Unsettling the Settler State. On behalf of the APRG, I thank both you, Mary and Morgan, for being here virtually today. So Mary, perhaps you would like to start the conversation. So I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks very much, Gil. How I'd actually like to start off is by talking about, first of all, my interest in politics and philosophy, and especially political philosophy, is the idea of that it seems like all human groups across the world, going way back, you know, very early societies, I've always been trying to figure out various things about ordering. Sometimes I've used the term, this is the Aboriginal society is a long-term experiment in human order making. Morgan has said similar sort of things like this. And some of the ideas about this ordering had to and still have to take into account problematics like authority and power, basically. So there was always an understanding that you have to have order, a social order of some sort, and also power. What to do with this particular problematic, because people are all different. We're all endowed with egos besides reflectivity and things like this. So we have to work out where we stand, where we fit into a society and so on. Those two things had to be sorted out by all different kinds of cultures. And they sorted them out in ways that suited them in their landscape, in their country, in their sphere of life and action and so on. From the Aboriginal point of view, probably because of a whole range of things like being isolated for a very long time. It's a huge island continent, many other continents like joined up with other, you know, they're all range of cultures within one continent, one huge continent. But how we approached it, it seems as if because we weren't interrupted, so to speak, by in any serious, harsh way, we came to a kind of conclusion about, well, not a conclusion, but saw a worldview that we shared across the whole continent, but that had its own autonomous identification of place, country, land, and areas within the continent. So we had a compromise, in a sense, from, if you like to understand it like this, from the very small, that is particular places, to the very large, that is having a monumental idea of having a stable, secure society across the continent, without people having a fundamentalist view of how life should be lived or what the rules should be and so on. So monumentalism, I believe, is a way of looking at our politics, political science, and political philosophy. So both politics and philosophy, that's how we tend to look at things in this way. It's inclusive, it's rational, it's efficient, it's sustainable, which is the favourite word that's given to Aboriginal people about looking after the land and so on. It's grounded, above all, it's grounded. And I guess I'll probably leave it there to carry on later. Morgan?
Yeah, sure. Well, hello, everyone. Great to be here with you. Thank you to Gil and others for this series. And Mary, as always, great to be in conversation with you. It's something we do quite regularly, bouncing
yes.
ideas between us, and it's nice to do it with you in this format. Just from my point of view, very quickly, I'll add my acknowledgements to ancestors and traditional owners right across the Australian continent, and particularly Darumbal people. That was where I was brought up, grown up as a person in central Queensland, in a semi-rural environment there. There's so much, of course, in what you've already said, Mary, in the way in which Aboriginal political ordering manages power and authority in the structuring of an overall political order. And I'm sure we'll talk more about that later on. But just to pick up one thing you've been talking about so far to move the conversation along, and this is your use of the word monumental, and this idea that there's a monumental conception going on here, conceptualization, sorry, occurring in Aboriginal approaches to ordering. And at other times you've spoken about Aboriginal law, which is connected with the dreaming and the country, and country is the nexus between dreaming and country as a monumental concept. And I think this is really quite striking, because what you're highlighting for people is that in this natural human experiment that you talk about, running over tens of thousands of years, you find that there have been developed ways of structuring, systematizing, and thinking about social and political ordering that deserve the label of being monumental. And they don't deserve the label of being monumental in the conventional way in which people talk about monuments, yeah. And in fact, there's probably a link here that it's precisely not about monuments, the products of the work of human hands, but the way in which humanity in Aboriginal political ordering is able to embed itself. You used the word grounded a moment ago, how it's able to embed or ground its understanding of order with and in landscape. And I think if you develop a system of ordering over tens of thousands of years that is not linked, we're talking about comparisons perhaps today with philosophy. This is philosophy of a different sort to what we usually think of in terms of philosophy being pursued through institutions like universities. It's a process, as we've written before, Mary, I think, of political design, where people work out slowly over extended periods of time how to develop a system of ordering which is integrated with the landscape, and that integration with landscape and grounding in landscape, that it's the continent, in a sense, that makes it monumental. So this is a system of ordering that is as big and monumental as the continent itself, as the landscape itself.
Yes.
At the same time, the genius of it is that it's not monumental in a sense of sitting as a striking hierarchy bearing over the top of each other. It enables people to find their place within the structures and systems. So this,
that's true.
Over to you.
Yeah. I was saying, I was talking to a friend of mine who, Dr. Irene Watson, talking about that she's kind of not stopped being interested in politics, but she is paying more attention to the law. She is a Pro-Vice Chancellor at the South Australian University of South Australia, a law lecturer, very expert in the Western law and in Aboriginal law. And she was talking about she is just going to pay more attention in her writings, her talks, if she continues with talking and so on, achieving things at that university. Not so much about politicking or in politics or anything like that, but pay more attention to what the law is. And it made me start thinking that perhaps that is actually our system here, developed over a long period of time, that what is called politics is actually the law, how we look at it, because the law explains a whole range of things. Plus, it takes into account life as in the vertical view, like into the land, but horizontal to the landscape. So all life forms across the land, So Aboriginal people had to work these things out, but taking into account essentially how we fit in to the land, how we fit in with the land, not just on it or in it, but with it, with other life forms, with each other, and not to forget about our I'm sorry. Taking into account this monumental view of looking at our ancestral our ancestors, our spiritual ancestors, now our ancient ancestors, not just our immediate ancestors, but the ancient ones, and looking at other than human ancestors too, all mixed in with multidimensional time, taking the view of multidimensional time. Now maybe we got that from basically living for tens of thousands of years, or it just came from learning how to fit in with each other and understanding what life in this country, according to our ways of wishing to live, basically, and learning to live and embedding things. Maybe it worked out like that. But I thought it got me thinking about, well, maybe we didn't have because when you look at the Aboriginal language map, I often say that map shows to me that is not just a language map, it's a map of social and political ordering systems right across the whole country. And every square inch of the country was somebody's responsibility and obligation to look after it. So maybe it's not just to do with politics, but it's to do with the law, this monumental idea of the law, of looking after, law of obligation, conduct, autonomy, along with autonomous regard of how you actually behave towards one another, and keeping in mind this wasn't ever, totally peaceful, because everybody will find in the old dreaming stories, there's plenty of stories about conflict and battles and so on. But to have the view of an ordered universe helps societies, all the different cultural groups across the country, to have confidence in their system. They have confidence that they are living and, over across generations with an ordered universe in mind. We're looking at that. So there's not a religious idea, it's not an ideological idea. It's what I call a Weltanschauung, that is a worldview idea, but a deep core belief, a deep core idea of what an ordered universe is. Not just could be, but is. So in a sense, we've got a meaning of life, not looking for a meaning of life, as in, I might be wrong here, but as in philosophy itself, not Western style philosophy, that is speculating about what things mean. Do you think, Morgan? I don't know.
Can I pick up on the relationship between law and politics and how people approach that? Because in a lot of consideration of law and politics, people are often tempted by or are drawn to law to authoritatively settle contests and issues that are, so to take us out of the destabilization and the fray of contestation and battle and so on, to authoritatively settle something through the law. Now, those scholars and thinkers who are particularly enamored with political contestation and debate sometimes get quite nervous about the idea of elevating law, because the elevation of law can see the ossification of a current set of power relations and the institutionalization and naturalization of those set of relations. And they say, well, what we need politics to contest whatever other systems and so on are put in place. And in fact, some political philosophers saying dissent and contestation is actually the core of what politics is. And we need to, of course, find ways to conduct that in ways that are responsible, but in fact, human societies need to hold on to that that desire, rather than to look for the surety that comes with ossifying systems and understandings in law that then get authoritatively visited upon subjects or citizens or whatever. Now, that's just to say that a contextual comment in a way on the relationship between politics and law. But then I think when we come to Aboriginal Australian law, we see something quite remarkable that goes to that depth of history in developing law or developing systems. Where you speak, Mary, about Aboriginal political ordering being a soft hierarchy. It's not to say there's no hierarchy at play, precisely because the landscape forms a kind of template for socio-political ordering. It's a soft hierarchy rather than one that is organised apically in the way that is organised with a sovereign with jurisdiction, total jurisdiction over a particular polity or geographical area.
Yes.
And I think this is, in a way, I think I've already said it today, but one of the things I'm struck by is the genius of Aboriginal political ordering, because I think part of what the law connected with country, going back to ancestor figures through the dreaming, enables is it gives people that sense of certainty and authority, and not just that, but the ontological security, the sense of being and belonging and always being located in some way. So it gives people that, but it gives them that with the option of contestation as well.
Yes, that's right.
There's not because each person is their own autonomous being.
Boss, really.
Their own boss, their own bearer of their own being, and that they are an interpreter of law. And so there's this paradox that's navigated. That's right. No, that's right. Which I think it's not that law continues and is enduring, and all societies say this. They say the law doesn't change. Meanwhile, the law is constantly changing.
Constantly changing. Yes.
So the law doesn't change, but people can contest and run political contests and pack away different histories into dreaming and law, which enable the evolution of a system. A lawful system to accommodate change and so on. So I think, in a way, that finessing of continuity and stability is one of the marvellous public political goods that Aboriginal order making achieves.
Yes. Yeah. And and it is a kind of finessing, this is why I always thought, I couldn't quite explain it even to myself, but talking about it with over years, with relatives, with other Murris, other Aboriginal people, about that in a basic sense, Aboriginal people are really, really like conservative, in the true meaning of the word conservative. Not only liking tradition is important, but continuity. People, and I know this sounds strange because it sounds like a class thing, but everybody knows their place. They're placed, but not in a class system, of course. And you are secure. People felt secure until colonialism came in. But if I could tell a small story from down this way, it explains, I think, some things about what you've just been talking about, Morgan. And I think you've heard me say this one. Around the coastlines of Australia, I don't know if it was every different group or even some other cultures who live on islands, small islands or whatever, where they arranged over long periods of time, arrangements between dolphins and humans to catch fish. So what the dolphins would do would herd fish into shallow areas, making it easier for humans to come and scoop them up onto the beach. And the idea was that the human group would take their share, and they would share a whole lot to whatever the amounts were to their mates, the dolphin mob. And so that goes on. And in this story, though, one day this person, a human mob, they decided not to do the sharing part. They decided to take the whole lot and not pay off the dolphins. And I know when people hear these stories, they think, oh, that's lovely. It's really good for children, isn't it? And so on and so on. but actually, what happens? What doesn't happen if it was a religiously viewed idea? The human mob ends up with all of it, doesn't do the right thing by sharing and so on. You would expect them to be punished severely, whatever, a lightning strike or something else bad happens. But nothing happens. In this case, in this story, nothing happens like that. They don't get punished. What happens is that the dolphin mob merely go away. They're still out there with themselves, living their life, and they're still there. But from then on, the human mob have to work harder. They have to work harder to get fish, basically. So what they've actually done is not just the wrong thing. I mean, if it was done in a Western law way or other kind of law way, there would have to be something to pay, some kind of punishment to pay for their actions. They don't really get punished, but they are, in a sense, because they have to work hard, work harder. But what is really happening is that a contract has been broken, an agreement between two different mobs. One of them just happens to be non-human, but they're a mob who owns themselves. They're an autonomous mob too. And I was saying this in every now and then I tell that story, but one particular time it was a whole group of lawyers and judges, I think, and they understood it, of course, straight away from a contract point of view. So it's not just the thing of a contract, which is a thing, but the way of which it is drawn up, and the way in which it is adhered to, and what happens when it isn't adhered to, when it's broken. So it's not just a case of a moral philosophy pursuing virtue. It's about an ordered universe where relationalist ethos with land, with all the other life forms, is adhered to, is admitted, is acknowledged all the time, and so on and so on. So how people conduct themselves is really, really important. In other words, their place in the world, and recognizing the place of other beings and so on. And if you look at it over a long period of time, really long, these ways of being, it becomes the law. Actually, that's why it becomes the law. So it's a lawful thing. So not only is it not, strictly speaking, politics, but it's not even a moral thing either. It's not ethics. It's the way of fitting in, an ordered universe, efficient, all that sort of stuff, rational.
One of the things that highlights for me, Mary, is this monumental political ordering system operates. Even though it's monumental, it's incredibly, as we were saying before, it's very grounded. So there's no appeal to transcendentalism, appealing to the transcendentalism of monotheistic religion to generate a moral set of tenets that people should adhere to. In fact, the relationalist ethos of existence becomes embedded through the kind of stories and experiences that you're talking to just now. And this also brings home for me that when people often come to thinking about Aboriginal political philosophy or political ordering, they naturally enough use their own background and their own to try to understand what's going on here. So they might, in terms of the two dominant frames for mainstream Australians and many others globally who are coming to Indigenous political thinking is to think in terms of monotheistic religions, or to think in terms of rationalist Enlightenment derived approaches to politics and so on. And I think part of what you're highlighting with that story for me is that these dominant frames don't capture, they cannot readily capture what's going on with Aboriginal political ordering and with law and so on. And just to draw out one little thing connected to that, that you were mentioning before, you said Aboriginal people, in your view, in many respects, are conservative. And sometimes I've thought, if you're coming to Aboriginal political ordering through through Western or dominant political ideologies, how would you describe Aboriginal political ordering? And my first answer is to say it's impossible, because, as we've just been talking, there isn't a way of translating. But if I was forced to say, how would you describe it? I would say Aboriginal political ordering and systems are a mix of conservatism and anarchism.
Yes.
So you have this, and that seems more or less impossible to a lot of people.
Yes.
But the combination of valuing continuity, protocol, tradition, and so on, while at the same time preserving very high levels of skepticism about institutionalized authority and order, and each person having the capacity to challenge, and this constantly being negotiated, I think, to me, is if you're combination of those two ideologies, as close as I can get, if you want to take that dominant understanding of political ideology to think about, to describe Aboriginal politics is.
Yeah, I think one really good thing that Aboriginal people had done is the great two problematics. I don't know if you can say it like this, but every human group having to sort out things about authority, because you have to have someone who knows about ordering, someone who has a judgment about things, not necessarily hierarchical, but some kind of a judgment coming from experience, knowledge, and so on, so authority. And the other one of power, what to do about power. And every different human group, it seems, had to work this out across the world. Every continent, going way back from old times. And I think Aboriginal people did something quite, what I always think is quite amazing. Whereas many others, most others, ancient places, ancient cultures and so on, conflated power and authority. And so if you had power, then you've got that gives you the right, or gives you the power. It doesn't give you any rights, actually, but you have the right to exercise power, to wield power. Authority, I should say. You have the power, so you're the authority for that culture, for that society, that population, and so on. And what it seems like what Aboriginal people did was they separated these two things. And again, that probably comes from a very long-standing, society of great age and all that kind of stuff and experience. They separated power and authority. And authority, which is kind of universal, that older people do have authority, the authority of age, but they turned it into, you could say, a political kind of way. That is, that they would be the authority which has influence. Their what do you call it? Exemplars. They have all kinds of qualities and skills that mark them out as knowledgeable people, basically, that older people, grey hair, white hair, have experience, knowledge, and so on. Younger people too, for all of their skills and their good self-conduct, good self-management skills, and so on and so on. So they're knowledgeable people. So knowledgeable people constitute authority. But the amazing thing is that they don't constitute power as such, because in this instance, authority is more powerful than power. And because the people, power is diffused throughout the people. So they sit beside each other, not not a hierarchy, but they sit beside each other, authority and power. It has to be shared in a flat system. It has to be shared. Yeah. So the authority people, knowledgeable people, would not be knowledgeable if they exercised their influence like power. They would show that they're not very knowledgeable at all. They would demonstrate it. So you've got to demonstrate this knowledge, their authority, by behaviour, whereas power is like a weapon, like a sword that you can wield, like a sword fight. You can punish, you can pull people into line, you can kill people, you can kill whole peoples, actually. You can command a whole big swathe of land or landscape, and so on and so on. So better, more competent, more safer, more efficient to separate them out. So the authority people, the knowledgeable people, don't order around the whole people, all the people. Power, I always think the old-fashioned slogan about power to the people. In a sense, it's like as if power to the people or power for the people. Aboriginal people discovered it, kind of thing. That's right and proper, because everybody is an autonomous being, and the way of conduct of autonomous beings is autonomous regard. So the possibility, or the risk, I should say, of conflict is lessened. It doesn't get rid of it, but it just lessens the amount of or the opportunities, or risks, I should say, of conflict. If you don't treat people badly, treat them, like with autonomous regard and so on. So they're not rulers. And of course, there's a whole range of other things like autonomy, besides autonomy, balance in the structure, female, gender-based governance, things like that. Not a hierarchy there. Place, I'm located, therefore I am, not I think, therefore I am. And of course, ethics being, and it sounds strange, there is no such thing as ethics, but there is the law, which takes the place of ethics, So those two big things, authority and power, I think it worked out differently across the world in other old cultures. But what we did, I think, in separating it, is just amazing. I think, for me, of all the things to be amazed about, that was one of it. Because you think, well, a self-regulating society, like I had, as you know, a row with somebody once. Well, a robust conversation about whether or not population can do without a state or not. A state with small s running the whole society, a civilizational state. So none of that here, but a civilizational culture with this different structure, not hierarchical, and balance between authority and power. It must have seemed, because it's worked out like this, that the old system over time was both stable, even though there were, as you say, there was accounts of, moments of that, of having conflict, accepting conflict, even having a place for it, anarchy, but it's a stable system. So I wouldn't say a peaceful system. I would always say stable and secure, and that's all that people can expect. Really, don't expect to find happiness and love and all the rest of it, and the answers to everything, and so on from a system that is taken care of by that autonomous regard.
You came back around to power and authority, which of course, you introduced at the beginning, and I expected we would come back to at some point. And I'm sure that perhaps some viewers or listeners might, in some of what you say, including the slogan "Power to the People" and so on, some viewers might see parallels or strong connections with the development of modern democracies and how liberalism operates, and so on. And there are connections there for sure, but I wanted to go back to your point about how often we see the conflation of power and authority. And this is very pervasive, both in the practice of dominant politics domestically and globally, and in the institutionalized thinking about what's possible for political ordering.
Yes.
And just on the first count, we only need to look at the Security Council of the United Nations to see the institutionalization of the post-war, post-Second World War power balance at play there, or see the emergence of states in Europe and the conflating of power with authority in the operation of those states. But one of the things that happens to our thinking in the aftermath of that conflation of power and authority is this idea that you referred to, that a state is necessary for political ordering. Famous various strands of thinking, perhaps most famously illustrated by Hobbes's work on the so-called state of nature, that we need a state to tame this unruliness which exists. Whereas Indigenous peoples around the globe demonstrated and continue to demonstrate that you do not need a state. You do not need this kind of hierarchical, typical political institution mobilizing violence and command obedience power relations in order to secure political order. So I think in a way, this is one of the big things that Indigenous peoples show. They hold up to the dominant society forms of political ordering, and they say what you think is necessary and foundational for political existence is in fact an anomaly that arises out of your own particular histories of hierarchy and violence and the conflation of power with authority. There are other ways of sourcing authority which are not linked to power, and which, then these are...
absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
Well, I've always thought it was, or the other reasoning in it is, it seems to me that things changed, and whether you say for the better or the good or worse or whatever, is when large agriculture comes in. And I'm not saying, shouldn't have happened or anything stupid like that. It's just people are in their continents at that time, in their time, things change and so on and so on. So when large agriculture comes in, large-scale agriculture, it seems to be coincide, but not by accident, with the rise of the state, with the rise of state. Now, when I say states, I mean old states, not nation states. That's not a very old, but a state like the Egyptian Empire, Persian, Chinese, Roman, Britain, even the ones in Latin America, they had that sort of thing too. But when that happens, something happens to all of the people. So land is technologized, people are technologized, and domesticatable animals especially. That is a kind of technologizing of other than human beings, and so on. So when that starts to happen, something happens to individuals, where this idea of the autonomy of a person has started to be controlled or changed or altered in some sort of way. And then from then on, they're not fully in charge of themselves. They don't own themselves because they are owned by, a state, a powerful coercive force, or some kind of a force. And from then on, it becomes a struggle. The struggle part of especially authority and power, and it just builds and builds. But it changes its dynamic too. It changes its nature. So people become more and more, what do they say? What's that word? Atomizing. That's a modern kind of thing, but I think it starts way back then. So I'll leave it to you.
Yeah, you're right there.
Yeah, look.
Yeah, and I think your thinking there about the emergence of early states is borne out in a recent book by James Scott called Against the Grain, where part of his thesis in there is, in fact, it's not agriculture, say, but grains in particular, which allow the appropriation and centralisation of a surplus that generate what is necessary for the development of early states and so on. And I think this flows through to the idea that I was mentioning before, that then hierarchy seems to start to become conflated as being synonymous with order or the possibility of order. And that is it's quite a striking conceptual development in how human beings have thought about order, and then has been incredibly influential, of course, ever since that time. And I think what we're talking about, I mean, it might seem in some ways so much of what we talk about with Aboriginal political ordering might seem marginal to a lot of people, to what goes on in the world. But in fact, I think at the moment we're dealing with, we're in a time where what is political ordering and what is up for grabs in political ordering is being reconceptualized. Of course, we've got big geopolitical shifts with the rise of China, and we've got Russia currently refusing to accept the dominant Western liberal rules-based order. And at the same, and you know, we've, for a few decades now, after the end of the Cold War, we haven't been discussing these things because of the hubris of liberalism, that you know, the triumphalism and so on. But I think Aboriginal political thought from this continent and other continents offers alternative ways of thinking about these foundational matters about political ordering, which are also then bound up with foundational matters of being, what it means to be a person, and then how do we order being together, which is part of politics.
I look at and I think of and have found what some of the main things about this ethical basis, but the law, there is a very powerful kind of idea of the law of obligation, and it goes into everything of looking after land. For example, just some sayings, land is the source of the law, say, but that's law, you know, LAW, LORE. The idea of looking at it as in Aboriginal sayings themselves right across the country of look after country, look after kin. So country always comes first. In other words, land comes first. So you could sort of call it other things like a sacralised ecological collaborative stewardship system. If there's any meaning to life collectively, it could be stewardship, which is just another form of law of obligation. But there are all kinds of things like law of, say, protocols and things like that, introducing ourselves in the beginning in this deeper way via family and place and so on. But it's not as if some of these things are not known in West, in the Western whole development. Like looking at something in Roman law, there was an idea about obligation in law, and I've been told by lawyers now that there's still something about obligation as being like, for example, someone who's, I don't know, passing an accident, or someone's had an accident, you are obliged to do something about it. You're not supposed to just drive off. So a hit and run accident, say, you know, something like that, but in all kinds of areas too. So obligation is not unknown. And one of the best examples of this I always point to is the National Health Service, invented by the UK from a Welsh Prime Minister, I think, if I'm not mistaken, post-war, post-Second World War. And the notion of it is wonderful. It's straight out obligation, the law, like a law. So, and it's policy. It's a big policy ticket item, as they'd say now. You have a health system that is free, offers, provides good quality healthcare to anybody at all, no matter what their income is, whether they're as poor as a church mouse, they can't afford anything, homeless people who have bad health or whatever. Everybody is welcome in that National Health Service. So now many modern societies do have it, you know, except for certain countries, which will remain nameless. who want to turn it into, and apparently this is happening at the moment with that Conservative government, with certain interested parties, want to change the NHS into not a law of obligation idea. So it's being starved of funds, it's being neglected, they're doing things wrong because of this neglect and not being funded properly, so on, so on, so on. So that is a straight out, from our point of view, if we never heard, Aboriginal people never heard of the National Health Service, we would say, that's a law of obligation, that's being carried out. So it's not as if the West doesn't know, and of course all the things, certain groups, parts of government want to do the right thing about looking after, taking care of the, climate change, look after the, do good things for the environment, the right things, and so on and so on. And of course, have more modern ideas about having fair sort of systems to do with Aboriginal affairs, which is just on that matter. I just believe Aboriginal affairs should be run by Aboriginal people, full stop. But of course, there wouldn't be Aboriginal people, Aboriginal affairs then. It wouldn't be a department probably. Yeah, obligation, the big one, looking after people, looking after things outside of the self, outside of the self, what would you call it, the unreflective motive. You have to have a reflective motive about these things to look beyond and look after, and so on and so on. So that's what makes me sort of wonder about how, and more people are thinking like this too, of course, how can we get to that sort of system? Because, and this is what I did want to ask you, Morgan, was even though we talk about it in all kinds of ways, is there a possibility for something so huge as this global system now, which a whole lot of other countries, cultures that do run their own place, they've either always run their own place or they've escaped colonialism and run it, but quite often still run it in a Western way according to the old colonial powers. Is it possible to even have a different global system? Because I think about, just briefly, about multipolarity, about unipolarity, empires going down the tube, because they become, in this day and age, they might have been powerful and controlling across the world or in their parts of the world. But now, in this time, with a gathering of perfect storms in all sorts of ways, are those old systems of empires, empire building and so on, is it useful anymore? I just think it's become so inefficient, economy-wise, too many countries being ruined, people in modern rich countries being, struggling to simply live, and so on. Can it change? That's what I want to know. Do you think, is that a possibility? How can it change? How can it change in a non-revolutionary way? A lot of really good writers I've read, alternative ones, that they all talk about the necessity for it to change, a globally ordered political system, but none of them have any ideas about it, because ideology is bankrupt, isn't it? Marxism, it's all bankrupt. Like religion, that's all bankrupt too. Where on earth do you begin?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know.
Political scientists ought to know. See?
Well, I don't know if it will change, but I think part of what Aboriginal political thought does is shows us some tools and some options, and shows that it can and should change, because part of what your work and work of others like you show us is that power and authority don't need to be conflated, and order not have to be hierarchized, and doesn't have to be characterized by domination and command obedience. So if you just take those basic principles and possibilities and put them into play, I think there is actually Oh, precisely because, as you were signalling just before, there are parts of the welfare state or parts of other state
Yes.
operations that have become quite durable, like the NHS or the Medicare system here in Australia is quite I think I would say, durable expectation on the
Yes.
part of the population that this is what characterises, not even aside from any normative judgments about what characterises a civilised
Yes.
society, this just characterises us. This is just part of who we are and what we do. So in a way, I think, even though this is we're talking about relatively new societies compared to ancient Aboriginal political ordering, I think you do see, even over a period of a few decades, the layering in of expectations about what should be foundational to human being together. That is linked precisely to relationalist law of obligation and so on. So I think those things are at play in, often more so in domestic politics. When you turn to global politics, where you see the play of power relations, which has been institutionalized and to some extent valorized in international affairs by realist international relations scholarship, I think the task there is harder. But I also think the disruption that we're currently seeing and experiencing should signal the possibility of other ways of relating and ordering. And there's plenty that happens on the international scene. There are remarkable instances of institutions of global cooperation operating every day that enable commerce and travel and a whole range of other things. But whether there is enough of the reflective motive operationalized at high levels of leadership in various countries to make that a kind of possibility is uncertain, of course. I mean, we've got from the Anglosphere, with the Anglosphere's big influence on international politics. I mean, one of the things that needs to be overcome for this sort of possibility you're referring to happen is liberal hubris needs to be and that might not be possible. And then you have the sort of what's going on Russia at the and arguably with China as well, quite parallel assertions of power and authority. So who knows, Mary, but one thing I'm quite certain of is that Aboriginal political thought is a resource for thinking differently and thinking better about politics at domestically and globally.
Just added to that, I've been in some different kinds of economic conferences or talks about economics and so on, and there is one coming up about the idea of a steady state economy, and being asked to do a kind of abstract. My idea was, a steady state. The notion of a steady state is in chemistry, apparently. Sorry, somebody at the door. Oh no, they're gone. A steady state economy. Yes, I use that term. And then I thought, well, I'll put in what I would talk about is, well, it's not any. It's important to, if they're looking at a steady state economy, the idea would be really good if they also looked at what a steady state society is, what a steady state culture is. You can't have one without the other. I really do believe. So from what I've been reading, and not that I understand a great deal about the economics, global or otherwise, different experts are saying it's time to look at the Bretton Woods idea of global economy post-World War II is going to have to change. It's going to have to change because a whole lot of political global things are changing. The economy, the overall global economy, but economies of other countries have to change. So that basic rule, global rule, is going to have to take into account different things. Now that all will impact on the whole of global societies, all around the world. And that would be, it seems to me, a really wonderful opportunity to have a different view, a different structure. I mean,
Yeah.
a multipolar, but they have to, the West anyway, has to come to terms with other powers, peoples, empires, whatever you want to call them, but a more flatter society. And that's why I sort of try and go back to, well, I do anyway. We end up back to being a multipolarity, so maybe it is time for, that old saying, it's time for a multipolar world. It might be forced on us in this economic way, not just in the fear of nuclear power and things like that. Do you think?
Yeah.
This is from an Aboriginal point of view.
Perhaps, yeah. And I think part of what that multipolarity there is a metaphor not for just the passing out of power relations globally, but thinking more foundationally about political ordering and drawing in peoples who haven't been in the conversation yet. Like I've been in conversations sometimes where people have said, well, everyone was there post 1945 for the Bretton Woods, or in 1945 for the Bretton, leading up to those international financial institutions, World Bank and IMF and so on. People were part of the conversations. But if you're thinking in terms of political philosophy at a more foundational level, that is not true. It's true that some anthropologists did engage in consultations with Indigenous peoples in the lead up to those, the Charter, the UN Charter of Human Rights and various other parts of that big institutional development at that time. But you can't say that the peoples of the world were thoroughly involved in conversations about setting up that institutional architecture. And I think if that consideration is forced on us again by current events and destabilisation linked to current events, and I think that's highly likely, then I think we should have this more foundational conversation about how do humans order their being together. Yeah.
The only, probably the last thing I wouldn't mind talking about is the whole, what I also see as a problematic, and you might already recall, Aboriginal people had an experiment put on us by the government called Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Commission, ATSIC. It was to help Aboriginal people understand and to learn to value democracy. So it was our first experiment in voting for our representatives and so on and so on. It didn't last because the government of the day just swept it away because, of course, as soon as you give Aboriginal people an opportunity or chance to run their own affairs, they take it, they grab it. And of course, that didn't go down too well with governments. So they actually started to think and act like that, as if we were running the country again, So that ended. So the next time was an Aboriginal idea. ATSIC wasn't an Aboriginal idea, really, basically. It was National Congress, which had nothing to do with democracy because people had already decided through interviews, research, focus groups, so they don't want anything like ATSIC. In other words, they didn't want democracy, but that was only 60-70% of the people. So they set up a flat society and a gender-based governance and so on and so on. And that only lasted until, again, the government got sick and tired of it. And, because, again, the Aboriginal people fell into the same habit of running the country, or thinking they were running the country. So the problem I've always seen, and we were talking about all this over these years when National Congress was in place, even though we had our own area, had our own policy making sort of exercises and so on, it still, was just swept away by the ruling power. But democracy, it seems to me, and what Aboriginal people saw in the things that are wrong with it, is that it's all very well to have the freedom to vote for. So you are a free person. You live in the West, you're a free person because you can vote, But that's the front end of the whole idea. The back end, nobody takes any notice of because the people who are voted in don't do all that much about all the things that are wrong in a society. So you can end up in a very powerful, great democracy like the US, and there are something like at the moment about 500,000 people that are homeless on the street, you know, with no health care. Oh, in fact, millions and millions of people have no health care at all. They're just poor, but people actually living on the street are about 500,000 people. So this is a great democracy, I suppose. So what happens when changes in global structures are going to happen, and that, but many people, not only in the West but in other countries, they want to hang on to democracy. And I guess could I say to Gil, if you want to, could I ask Gil to come into this, because this discussion, love, about, I'm sorry, saying love, but
That's all right, man.
the whole dilemma of all this, of having a global system where many people, not Aboriginal people, and probably not Indigenous people like us, you know, care too much for democracy. They'd rather go straight to, or if the notion of democracy had a foundational underpinning of a law of obligation, then people who are voted into a system, they have to, the system, not just the people, the government system has to make sure that there are no poverty-stricken people living on streets in a democracy. You know, I mean, so either yourself, Morgan, you know, say something about that.
Can I just ask a question of you both on that topic, because I've been burning to ask a question on that. And that is, you mentioned with the ATSIC, setting up with ATSIC, and you mentioned it being an experiment in democracy, which I'll get to in a minute. But Morgan also rightfully pointed out the many things that you were saying are compatible with not so much liberal democracy, but, you know, the kinds of alternative democracies that we see with deliberative democracies and demarchies and associative democracies and various other democracies that don't focus on the freedom and independence of individuals as a starting point, or on representative democracy. So I guess my question here is, when the government talked about an experiment in democracy, it was really demanding that Aboriginal mobs get together and enforce a kind of liberal democracy on them.
It was a modernisation experiment. That's what it was, actually.
Whereas my question then is, why not do the following, saying that an experiment in democracy is a two-way street? It's a form of autonomous regard. So why not ask that an experiment with democracy is also that Western authority and power give up the notion of a liberal democracy and experiment with new forms of democracy, as you say, that might start off with an obligation. And even under the current model, it could be an obligation to have a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. So that there is
definitely one.
So that was the kind of, I guess, the question I want to pose to you both is it possible to perhaps make that a starting point?
Well, a starting point for discussion, for sure. For sure. Whether or not, and again, it comes back to this probably political party authority, like power. What did you call it, Morgan? Power plays, power battles, you know, between people who like the old thing of just telling people what to do, basically, and others saying, well, everybody's got an opinion about something, and so on and so on. Do you think? I'm not quite sure how to answer.
Yeah, well, look, I think
hard to discuss it. That's all.
Yeah, I think there is. If there was vision and commitment from the political class and others in Australia, I think the sort of thing you're talking about, Gil, is very interesting and would have a lot of potential. I mean, whether it will happen or not is is another matter. But I think there are rhetorical anchors or levers for this kind of thing. What you're talking about with this continent is the world's oldest continuous civilization, oldest living people, Aboriginal people. This is a trope that is bandied around quite a lot at the moment. And then with mainstream settler-derived Australia, you've got, the most technologically advanced, economically driven, acquisitive society in recent times. And this is a remarkable combination coming together on the Australian scene. So why not use that remarkable combination to engage precisely, as you say, in a kind of experiment of a kind of a nation-building experiment and political ordering experiment for the 21st century? How do we, and the goals are quite obvious and quite shared, how do we live here together securely and sustainably and inclusively? The uncontroversial kind of a goal. So I think there is great potential, and there's plenty of touch points, as you were saying, Gil, between these two traditions, including even at the level of individual freedoms, notions of personal autonomy in Aboriginal political ordering that Mary and I have spoken about, mesh or touch in quite interesting and quite resonant ways with ideas of liberal individual freedoms. And so I think it's a highly suggestive and almost fecund arrangement that circumstance that we find ourselves in. Of course, part of what we grapple with, as Mary's pointed out many times, is that mainstream Australia feels deeply insecure about its and belonging on this continent, and continues in that insecurity to behave in morally indefensible ways toward Indigenous people. But my hope is that for the kind of experiment that you point to, is that the longer non-Indigenous people spend in Australia, the more they will necessarily come to realise that the very possibility of their own secure and grounded belonging and existence in this continent relies upon dealing in a head-on way with the fact of colonisation and its aftermath, and that naturally sets up precisely the kind of experiment and exchange that you're referring to. So I think there is possibility for that, and there are micro anecdotes of this. Aboriginal people in rural areas sometimes say the longer white fellas are here, and they're talking about generations of graziers. Often the country starts to speak to them, and then they feel that that's the foundation for relationship. There are some very good relationships.
Yeah, there are. There's no doubting. No denying it.
Despite the view from the inner cities of progressive.
Yes, lattes drinking.
Said that nothing good happens in rural environments. There are quite remarkable and illustrative and relationships between Indigenous people and graziers in parts of the continent. And if that kind of relationship, that relating can be writ large, then I think there is a foundation for this experiment and exchange precisely that you're talking about.
Pardon me. Do you think, Gil, that what we're trying to do, APRG, we're looking at things in a very long-term view, I suppose, of developing gradually an Australian philosophy. And when we had that Australasian philosophy conference down here at Bond, I was talking about a Weltanschauung then, do you know? But it will be a long-term thing. But in practical terms, like Morgan was just saying, if there was more attention, I mean, not just more, but humongous attention to looking after land, because this is how the psychology, if you like, or spirituality, if you like, of embedding this idea of law of obligation to land first, something outside of the self. So it's not so much not progression and progressiveness or modernization. I always used to ask myself, why does modernization have to mean westernization? Do you know what I mean? Why isn't some things about our system is ancient, but it is also actually unbelievably modern, like multipolarity, So learning that, but embedding it and internalizing it, not just in individual humans, but groups, but also the polity. Can you say that, Morgan? The polity, you know, in the political class, embedded in there about looking after something outside of the self. As soon as and start with land, of course, because that's the idea of it. You're not going to turn everybody into very highly ethical, principled people, you know, in politics. You know, they're not. But if they start doing it, practice makes perfect. So practice on the land, looking after it properly. They gradually get the idea that, and then you can see that hopefully, you know, a worldview, a Weltanschauung, the beginnings, just a tiny beginning. And it would be, I always, because I'm very ambitious, you know, Morgan too, you know that, that I think it would be wonderful if a settler colonial country, not very many years old, and as America is, and the insecurity is screaming out, I do believe, you know, insecurity, especially in that country, but here too, because this country always follows that country, because they're both settler countries, colonial countries. They would be like that Bruce Latour we were talking about, you know, come down to earth. They would, you come down to earth by aiming higher.
Yeah,
you know what I mean? That's that sort of contradictory kind of thing that would happen here. But we're talking about long-term stuff. But it's starting. You know, it gradually is starting. They just have to, certain things they have to definitely give up, like killing Aboriginal people via the authorities. That would be a good idea. You know, I hate to be, you know, skeptical or cynical about it, but they'd have to stop doing things like that.
I think,
you know.
I think you just raised a very important point, and I think it's a nice place to close our conversation. But I just wanted to say on that, I think when you mentioned the APRG, what we're trying to do, this is our second conversation, and I want to thank you both for a very, very fascinating conversation on this area of broadening the idea of governance to be beyond just conflating power and
that's right,
and authority and just looking at liberal democracy. So what I hope that we can achieve with these and future conversations is that more people start to listen to what we have to, the guests that you get on here, and recognizing there's more to just a Western view and seeing various other positioning, so we can start to have this dialogue. So for all that, I would like to thank both of you once again for your offering your generous time, and I hope that this conversation continues both with us and with various other people.
Thank you, Gil. So it's a great opportunity. Thanks
you
a lot.
Very much.
Thanks very much.
Thanks,
Bye.
Gil.
Bye all.